Most predators are chaotic. They are creatures of impulse, leaving a trail of biological noise that eventually catches up to them. But what if the predator is an architect? What if he views a murder not as a crime, but as a structural challenge? For 13 years, the Long Island serial killer didn't just evade the law. He engineered a vacuum. He exploited the signal-to-noise ratio of the world's densest city to remain a ghost in the machine. We weren't looking for a monster. We were looking for a man who understood the structural layout of human misery. And he was hiding in plain sight, checking his watch on the 5:14 to Massapequa. May 2010, a 23-minute anomaly. Shannon Gilbert's 911 call wasn't a lead. It was a system crash. Her frantic plea from the gated community of Oak Beach was a glitch in a carefully maintained perimeter. While searching for a single woman in the marshlands, K9 units stumbled upon a graveyard. But this wasn't a haphazard disposal site. This was a linear array. 4 bodies, all found within 500 feet of each other, bound in industrial-grade burlap. His wasn't mere fabric. This was an intentional choice of biological containment. Burlap is a breathable, heavy-duty material used in landscaping and construction. It mimics the organic texture of the earth while resisting the salt-heavy decay of the Atlantic air. It was a professional's choice, a way to ensure the assets remained exactly where they were placed, shielded from the elements, but integrated into the geography. The Gilgo 4, Melissa Bartholomew, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, Maureen Brainerd Barnes. They were petite, vulnerable, and categorized by the killer as expendable data. But the precision of their placement suggested a mind that thought in blueprints. The killer had mapped out the Ocean Parkway as a personal annex, a dark basement with no walls. In the forensic world, we speak of chain of custody, but in Suffolk County, the chain was rusted from the top down. Police Chief James Burke didn't just lead the investigation. He throttled it. He disconnected the FBI, creating an information silo that allowed the killer to remain invisible in the sector-based handovers of the suburban landscape. The killer knew the limits of our technology. When he placed taunting calls to the families of his victims, he didn't do it from a dark alley. He did it from the heart of Manhattan. Penn Station, Madison Square Garden. He was exploiting radio frequency saturation. In a high-density urban environment, the triangulation margin of error expands exponentially. By moving through a crowd of 600,000 commuters, his device was lost in a sea of cell site simulators and overlapping frequencies. He wasn't just making a call. He was hiding his digital signature behind the heartbeat of New York City. He knew that for a detective, finding one specific signal in that noise was a mathematical impossibility. He lived a life of extreme compartmentalization. In the morning, he was Rex Heuermann, the meticulous architect, a master of NYC building codes, a man who understood how to navigate the city's bureaucracy to get things built. At night, he used that same knowledge of systems and shadows to tear things down. For 13 years, he believed he had built the perfect structure of silence. He believed his technical mastery of the grid made him untouchable. But even the best architects make mistakes in the foundation. He didn't realize that in the world of modern forensics, the grid never forgets. And while he was busy watching the police, a new kind of database was quietly being built to watch him. He thought he was the one looking through the glass. He didn't realize he was the one being measured. To understand the monster, you must understand the concept of compartmentalization. In psychology, it is a defense mechanism, a way to keep conflicting ideas or lives from touching. For Rex Heuermann, it was more than a tactic. It was a behavioral blueprint. By day, Heuermann was a fixture of the New York City skyline. He was a consultant for major architectural firms, a man who spoke the language of building codes and structural safety. He was the one you hired to ensure a building wouldn't collapse. This wasn't a double life in the cinematic sense. It was a structural necessity. The same precision he used to calculate the load-bearing capacity of a floor was used to calculate the risk of a disposal site. He treated his crimes like a high-rise project. Layers of insulation, rigid schedules, and a total separation of the domestic from the predatory. When he sat at his desk in Midtown, the marshes of Gilgo Beach didn't exist. When he was in the marshes, the Manhattan architect was dead. He moved between these worlds with the steady breathing of a man who believed his own lie. He wasn't hiding. He was simply existing in a room with no doors. Every structure has a flaw, a point of failure where the weight becomes too much for the frame to bear. For Heuermann, that flaw was a physical trace left behind in 2010. A witness had seen it. A first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche parked in the driveway of a victim shortly before she vanished. It was a specific vehicle, a massive, distinctive utility truck that didn't belong in the quiet, cramped streets of the South Shore. But for over a decade, this data point was lost to investigative inertia. The tip sat in a file, buried under the weight of a corrupted administration. It was a ghost in the system, a critical piece of evidence trapped in a corrupted silo. It wasn't until the 2022 task force reopened the case that they stopped looking for a myth and started looking for a truck. They filtered the data. Chevrolet Avalanche, registered in Nassau County, linked to a man with a residence in Massapequa Park and an office in Manhattan. The search didn't lead to a criminal underworld. It led to a permit-filing architect. The physical fragment had finally been matched to the structural ghost. When the task force identified Heuermann, they didn't kick in his door. They leaned into clinical patience. They knew that a man of his intelligence would be hyper-aware of any sudden change in his environment. They began a slow burn surveillance. They studied his predictable patterns, the time he left for the train, the way he carried his briefcase, the specific trash cans he used in Manhattan. They weren't just watching him. They were mapping him. They watched him eat pizza. They watched him discard a crust. To the world, it was garbage. To the task force, it was the final brick in the wall. They were using his own obsession with detail against him. If Heuermann was a man of habit, those habits would eventually become his handcuffs. Heuermann felt invisible because he had engineered his life to be a series of blind spots. He didn't realize that the task force had built a mirror. Every move he made was being logged into a new database, one designed specifically to hold him. The hunter was now the specimen. He thought he was the architect of the perfect crime, but he was actually building his own cage. For over a decade, the silence along Ocean Parkway wasn't just a lack of noise. It was a deliberate engineered void. In architecture, a void is a space defined by what surrounds it. For the families of the Gilgo Four, that void was shaped by the absence of justice. A 10-year cold case that felt less like a mystery and more like a structural flaw in the universe. Rex Heuermann lived in the shadows of his own design. He had created a masterpiece of obfuscation. By day, he navigated the rigid, complex building codes of New York City, a world where every inch of steel and every gallon of concrete must be accounted for. By night, he applied that same forensic heavy precision to the disposal of human life. He believed he had built a life that was perfectly encrypted. He had scrubbed his digital footprint, used burner phones with the skill of an intelligence officer, and chose disposal sites that the Atlantic would eventually reclaim. But there is one thing an architect cannot account for. One variable that cannot be smoothed over with a drafting pen or hidden behind a firewall: biology. While Rex was busy perfecting the structure of his crimes, his own body was leaving behind a confession he couldn't hear. January 2023, Midtown Manhattan. The task force has a name. They have a vehicle. They have a pattern. But in the eyes of the law, a pattern is not a conviction. They needed a forensic footprint. They needed the man's essence. Surveillance teams watched as Rex Heuermann stepped out of his office on Fifth Avenue. He looked like any other tired professional, grabbing a quick slice before the commute back to the suburbs. It is a mundane, almost boring human ritual. But as he discarded that pizza box into a trash can, he was unknowingly handing over the keys to his kingdom. This is the Pizza Crust Protocol. In the world of high-stakes surveillance, we are defined by what we throw away. We leave pieces of our identity in the trash can cells, saliva, the very blueprint of our existence. To Rex, this was garbage. To the investigators, this was the biological breach. They didn't need to hack his computer. They just needed to wait for his humanity to fail him. They recovered the crust, and with it, the DNA that would bridge a 13-year gap between the skyscraper and the swamp. To understand why it took 13 years, we have to look at the evolution of the search. In 2010, the Gilgo 4 were found with 11 tiny hairs on their bodies, some belonging to the killer, some to his family. At the time, nuclear DNA, the kind we see in TV shows that provides a perfect match, was degraded by the harsh, salty environment of the Long Island shore. A gearchitect thought the elements had scrubbed his sins clean. But forensics evolved into mitochondrial sequencing. Unlike nuclear DNA, which is a combination of both parents, mitochondrial DNA is passed down solely from the mother. It is hardier. It survives in the shaft of a hair, even when the root is gone. It is the biological snitch that lives in the power plant of our cells. The task force didn't just find a match. They found a statistical certainty. The hair found on the burlap, the industrial-grade material Rex used to contain, his victims matched the DNA on that discarded pizza crust. The probability of it being anyone else was 1 in trillions. The architect had planned for every digital contingency, but he couldn't encrypt the microscopic strands of hair that fell from his clothes as he worked. His own biological residue had become the very evidence he spent a decade trying to obfuscate. How does a man live in a mirror? This is the most haunting aspect of the Heuermann case, the compartmentalization collapse. Forensic psychologists look for the seams in a double life. For Rex, the seams were invisible. He would spend his nights in his basement, allegedly engaging in a digital odyssey of torture and forensic heavy searches, studying the very techniques the police were using to find him. And then he would walk upstairs. He would have dinner with his wife. He would attend community meetings. He was a father, a neighbor, a husband. While he was mapping out the stolen futures of women like Melissa Barthélemy and Amber Lynn Costello, he was building a traditional future for his own family. Imagine the psychological weight of that realization for those who shared his home. To discover that the man who checked the locks at night was the reason the neighborhood needed locks in the first place. The architect had built a house of cards, and the foundation was made of secrets. When the biological breach occurred, the mirror didn't just crack. It shattered, exposing the monster to the very people he pretended to protect. There is a profound, poetic irony in the fall of Rex Heuermann. He was a man obsessed with the inorganic, with steel, concrete, digital obfuscation, and architectural precision. He treated his victims like structural debris to be cleared away and filed. He believed that if he could control the data, he could control the reality. But biology is the only thing the architect couldn't encrypt. It is the one system that doesn't follow a building code. A microscopic strand of hair, a discarded piece of bread. The very things that make us human, our mesances, our biological shedding, were the tools of his undoing. In the end, the L.I.S.K database wasn't solved by a brilliant detective's hunch or a sudden confession. It was solved by the inevitable failure of a man who forgot that while you can build a cage for others, you can never truly escape the one you were born in. July 2023. The quiet of Massapequa Park wasn't broken by a bang, but by the sound of boots on pavement and the rustle of Tyvek suits. For decades, Rex Heuermann lived here. A man who was a neighbor in the most generic sense of the word. He was the man with the messy yard, or the tall guy in the suit. He was a background character in the lives of everyone on First Avenue. Imagine the psychological whiplash. You've shared street space with this man for 20 years. You've seen him carry groceries. You've seen him rake leaves. And now, you are watching a swarm of forensic technicians, the white suit ghosts, systematically dismantle his home. This is the structural collapse of a suburban lie. When the architect was finally let out in handcuffs, the neighborhood didn't see a monster. They saw a middle-aged man in a polo shirt. That is the true horror of the L.I.S.K database. It isn't the fangs. It's the camouflage. The realization that the person living in the house next door, the one whose blueprints you might have trusted, was actually designing a graveyard. As investigators breached the threshold of the Heuermann residence, they found what every architect hides, the foundation. But this foundation contained a vault, a walk-in reinforced room that was not part of the original town filings. Inside, they found a collection of over 200 firearms. In the mind of an architect, a vault is the ultimate expression of structural integrity. It is a space where the outside world cannot intrude. For Rex, this wasn't just a hobby. It was an obsession with total control. Everything was cataloged. Everything was filed. This basement was the physical manifestation of his psyche, a place where his dark data was kept under lock and key. Psychologically, the vault represents the ultimate compartmentalization. Above ground, he was a servant of the city's building codes. Below ground, he was the sovereign of his own violent museum. The discovery of this hidden infrastructure proved that his life wasn't just a series of mistakes, it was an elaborately planned fortress of secrets. For 13 years, the L.I.S.K case was defined by the killer, his mystery, his shadow. But as the architect sits in a cell, the focus must shift back to the lives he tried to erase. This is the restoration of Mame. While Rex Heuermann was building a career in Manhattan, Melissa Barthélemy, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, and Maureen Brainerd Barnes were being reduced to Jane Does and unidentified remains. He viewed them as structural waste variables to be eliminated. But the state's victory isn't just about a life sentence for a man in a suit. It is about the fact that their stories have been reclaimed. They are no longer footnotes in a serial killer's biography. They are daughters, sisters, and mothers whose futures were stolen by a man obsessed with his own reflection. The database is finally being purged of its cold clinical labels and refilled with the weight of human memory. We are not just closing a file. We are honoring a soul. Science gave us the answers. Mitochondrial DNA found the strand of hair. Digital forensics traced the burner phones. Biology betrayed the intellect. But science cannot provide the why. The final verdict isn't found in a lab report. It's found in the resilience of the human spirit. For 13 years, the families refused to let the void win. They pushed against the investigative inertia and the systemic corruption until the truth had no choice but to emerge. Rex Heuermann tried to build a monument to his own invisibility, but he forgot that a structure built on a foundation of lies is destined to sink. The truth isn't just a set of data points, it is a living, breathing force. And while the architect's name will eventually fade into the archives of infamy, the empathy we feel for his victims, the light we keep for them, is the only thing that will outlive the monster. The files are closing. The grid is complete. The monster has been cataloged. The L.I.S.K database is no longer a collection of cold traces. It is a record of justice. Thank you for walking through these files with us. If you found value in this investigation, consider joining our search for the truth. Until the next case, stay safe, stay alive,